Russian Nazis of Donbass, extremist groups in Donetsk and Luhansk, the right podcast. This video will discuss the modern conflict in Eastern Ukraine, extremists in Donbass and Russian ties, broader Russian support for white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and ultranationalists, as well as a conclusion with some editorializing. If you're already aware of the modern conflict in Eastern Ukraine, feel free to skip ahead a few minutes. So, lay of the land. Here we have a map of Ukraine, and all the yellow territory to the north and to the east is Russia. So Ukraine shares a very large border with Russia. Below my image, there is a red arrow pointing to a red dot of Luhansk, and below Luhansk, Donetsk. And these are going to be two very important areas for this discussion, because this area in general, the geographical region, is called Donbass, and we might be using these terms interchangeably. They're significant because Donetsk, Luhansk, or collectively Donbass and broader geographic areas, that's the region that broke away from Ukraine after 2014, and we'll talk about that. Another area of significance is on the very bottom of this map, the Crimean Peninsula. And this is important because also 2014, Russia annexed the territory. Sandwiched between Donetsk and Crimea is Mariupol. And Mariupol is important because it's in the middle of these two flashpoints. It's in the news right now. There's heavy fighting occurring, and it's also the home of the Azov Battalion. If you're interested in learning more about the Azov Battalion, we have a video on them. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to run through this timeline fairly quickly. However, if you are more interested in going in depth into these topics, check out our video on the Azov Battalion. But for this video, modern conflict in Eastern Ukraine. Well, let's start in 2014 with the Euromaidan protests. The Euromaidan protests were called Euromaidan because first they occurred on Maidan Square, and because the trigger event or the grievance was about then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych not signing the Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement, but instead accepting a less favorable financial bailout from Russia. There's a lot behind this, and we're not going to get into it all in this video, but big story, long story short, this was seen as the president siding with Russia, perhaps being a puppet of Russia, and not having Ukraine's best interests in mind. This led to a coup government, or the Revolution of Dignity, and that event triggered other events throughout Ukraine. Now, I do want to stress that this is not necessarily a vertical timeline of events, meaning that they are in specific order. However, let's describe it in that way for this video. So we have the Revolution of Dignity, and then Russia annexes pieces of Ukraine, the Ukrainian peninsula. After Ukraine is annexed or concurrent to, Donetsk and Luhansk break away. Russia supports the breakaway paramilitaries in the region of Donbass. Now, again, I want to stress that this is not necessarily consecutive order. There were Russian special services, mercenaries, figures that we will soon see were tied to white supremacist, neo-Nazi, and other far-right extremist groups in Russia already in these areas, stirring trouble or preparing for these events that later occurred. A phrase that's used for some of these folks would be the little green men, because they were essentially Russian soldiers without any insignia on their uniforms. And again, if you're watching the video, I have something of a timeline of events set up, stressing that these aren't necessarily in order, but just so we can have a conceptual understanding of what occurred. We have the president of Ukraine being ousted after Euromaidan protests, resulting in Revolution of Dignity. An interim government is put in place. The EU Association Agreement is signed, and then there were some changes to the constitution as well. After the interim government was in place and made these changes, there was a general election and Petro Poroshenko won. Concurrent to this, fighting began in the Donbas region. And so this brings us to the real topic of this video, extremists in Donbas. So before we delve into specific groups, I think first we need to step back and take a look at the big picture here. Concepts of Russian far-right nationalism, because I think for the Western mind, it's much easier to look at perhaps the Azov Battalion in Ukraine and see a swastika. And in the West, our education system, our culture, perhaps our collective unconscious ties very directly to fascism and Nazi Germany. And so, in short, that connection is tangible. It's somewhat automatic and subconscious. Now, we'll certainly see far-right nationalists of the Russian flavor flying swastikas too, but the ties to fascism and what fascism means might seem a bit more obscured because it is of a Russian flavor. And there are reasons for that. And again, I've mentioned it twice, but if you would like to know more about that Ukrainian tie and why that's so direct and what happened in World War II, check out the Azov Battalion video. However, for this video, let's have a broad discussion of concepts of that Russian far-right nationalism. So the first concept in what most of these groups that we're going to look at share is an idea of a divided ethnicity. And so that means that the current country of Russia, the current country of Belarus, the current country of Ukraine, that these are essentially partitions or lines drawn in the sand, and that they are artificially dividing what is a collective ethnicity. So this ties into a concept of imperialism, or idea that Russia naturally owns this territory, right, of a collective ethnicity and people. And it also disparages anyone, almost like a race traitor in a discussion you might have with a white supremacist in the United States, right? There's this idea of, if you are against this concept of collective ethnicity, then you are less than, lower than, or at the very least an enemy. Now, specifically, the breakaway republic of Donetsk and Luhansk, the idea of them breaking away from Ukraine is not new. And we'll check out a website and document that discusses Eurasian Youth Union Training, which is an extremist group organization dating back to 2005 that essentially was training, preparing extremist and paramilitary groups for such an event. Someone who we're not going to necessarily focus on, but who is extremely important in the background and a major player in far-right Russian nationalism is going to be Alexander Dugan. And I put him here because he has a phrase, fascist fascism. And I find this phrase interesting when we're talking about Russia, because again, we think of the swastika, we think of Germany, maybe Italy, secondly. However, these ideas of fascism have been co-opted, adopted, repackaged, and presented again within a Russian point of view. And this idea of fascist fascism, I think, is an interesting way to explain that. Lastly, just in general, these groups might have a specific emphasis for what it is that they believe. It might be political ideology. It might be this idea of empire. However, within these two concepts, there's going to be a mixture maybe more important to one, less significant to another, but still both existing concepts of race and ethnicity, as well as religion. So I have here an article, Russian Eurasianism, an ideology of empire. And we're going to take a second to view this, because I think that this provides a nice overview of modern 1990s and up Russian totalitarian imperialism. So I think that maybe the center of this paragraph down is where we want to focus. And this states that one of the authors here, Laurel, she identifies as one, a rejection of Europe, the West, and capitalism through criticism of Atlanticism domination, or the West, as being considered disastrous to the rest of mankind, an assertion of cultural unity and common historical destiny of Russian and non-Russian peoples of Russia, the former Soviet Union, and parts of Asia. The idea that the central geographical location of Eurasia space naturally and inevitably entails an imperial form of political organization, and that any secession is destined to fail, leaving newly independent states no choice but to revert back to a unified political entity, and for a belief in the existence of cultural constants that explain the deeper meaning of contemporary political events. And I'd also like to highlight this section as well. With the intellectual retreat of Marxism, socioeconomic explanations seem to have been supplanted by the idea that only national identities, cultures, and religions can explain the world today. The widespread acceptance of Eurasianism confirms that the former Soviet Union is fully in tune with the major ideological developments taking place across the planet in the 21st century. This is a paper that I'm going to use somewhat extensively in this video. It's called The Far Right in the Conflict Between Russia and Ukraine. It's very fair. It describes the far right on both sides of this issue. So we read some what I would consider fairly abstract ideas about Russian imperialism and Russian thought, 1990s and up. I think that this section of the paper kind of brings this and contextualizes this altogether. So here it says, from the early 1990s, Russian national radicals typically denied Ukraine's right to exist as an independent state. This is central to most of these far right radical Russian nationalist groups. So he provides some examples, but I think that down here is where we want to look. The influential neo-Eurasianist thinker Alexander Dugan has stated that as an independent state, Ukraine represents a grave danger for the whole of Eurasia, and without solving the Ukrainian problem, talking about continental geopolitics at all is pointless. Many ethno-nationalist parties, such as the Russian All-National Union, have also proclaimed that it is necessary to unite Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus into a single state. So building on this concept, Russian nationalists regularly exploited the post-imperial thesis of Russian people being divided by these new borders. This concept of reuniting was called the Russian Project. Later in 2003, this demand reappeared unaltered in the program of the National Sovereignty Party of Russia, one of the last attempts to create a unified radical nationalist political force. Now, this section is especially important because we're not talking about concepts or ideologies. Now we're getting into actual events, concrete things that occurred in Ukraine. An important place in the activity of Russian national radicals was given to staking territorial claims and taking steps designed to stir up pro-Russian activism in Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine. Activism frequently in illegal ways. Between 2006 and 2009, so this is 2006, okay? For instance, activists from Donetsk Republic movements took part in training camps run by the Eurasian Youth Union. They propagated the ideology of pro-Russian separatism in Donbass, and as early as 2005, invented the symbolism that would later gain official status in the Donetsk People's Republic. Participants in EYU events learned to handle weapons, among other things. So I'm going to stop there because then it gets into 2008, and some other things happened in 2008 too, such as Russian invasion of Georgia. But stepping back, this is important because we have a fundamental concept that we can build around when we get into these specific groups, and it's this idea of a new old way of thinking, a post-90s, post-Soviet concept of Russia, which is not material history. It's not scientific socialism. It's not Marxism anymore. Now it is ethnicity. Now it is religion. Now it is culture. And this is when we get into these, what we could call fourth way politics, right? When we're embracing fascist fascism or reinventing it with a Russian spin. Well, we have these ideas of saying, okay, sovereignty doesn't exist. That's an Atlanticism kind of view of things. What does exist are the Volk, or the people, right, of Russia. And as early as 2005, let's say, we have extremist groups training, and extremist groups from Russia, right, going into Eastern Ukraine with an understanding that through events that occurred in history, which we're not going to talk about, that understanding in Eastern Ukraine, there are more Russian-speaking people, more people that might self-identify maybe ethnically as Russian, and beginning to lay the groundwork for what's going to be the Russian project of many years that we'll see now has essentially accumulated or presented itself as the breakaway republics in Donbass. And this article is from the New Republic. And I'd like to just highlight this section here because it kind of just goes over what was just stated in that more academic paper. The Russian attempt to control Ukraine is based upon Eurasian ideology, which explicitly rejects liberal democracy. The founder of the Eurasian movement is an actual fascist, Alexander Dugan, who calls for a revolution of values from Portugal to Siberia. The man responsible for Ukraine policy, Sergei Glaziev, used to run a far-right nationalist party that was banned for its racist electoral campaign. And so this is somewhat of a more mainstream article. It's nice because it provides us with a straightforward definition of some of the more abstract things that we discussed. This is dated March 17, 2014. So the interesting thing about what we talked about to this point is that we're not just talking about a specific group, right? We're not talking about, I don't know, like the Azov Battalion. Instead, what we're talking about are concepts and ideas that are very important and inform Russian foreign policy. Let's move away from that abstract big picture kind of ideology to some actual groups. And the first one is perhaps the most important, Russian Imperial movement. The Russian Imperial movement was designated a terrorist organization by the US State Department. This was somewhat big news a few years ago. However, for some reason, we don't hear about them anymore. Azov is everywhere. You go on Twitter, social media, Ukraine is Nazis. We hear nothing about RAM. Through 2014 and 2016, the group gained power and influence. It trained and equipped pro-Russian fighters in Eastern Ukraine. RAM operates under the direction of Russian-supported governments, DPR and LPR, the breakaway republic governments. So to delve into this and also to show the sources, let's start with somewhat of a mainstream media content platform here and look at the Washington Post. This was an article from 2020 titled "Inside White Supremacist Russian Imperial Movement, Designated Foreign Terrorist Organization by the US State Department." When the State Department designated a Russian white supremacist group, the Russian Imperial Movement, as a terrorist entity this month, some supporters saw it as an honor, almost like a coming-of-age moment. For RAM leader Stanislav Vorobyov, it was affirming. A reward, he said in a social media post. The terrorist designation marks a US shot across the bow on Russian authorities' relative tolerance of RAM and an associated paramilitary training operation outside of St. Petersburg. Linking this to the war in Ukraine, we have the former top military figure in the Donetsk People's Republic praising the group for its designation by Washington as a terrorist organization. The designation comes amid concerns over increasing violence by far-right groups as militant Russian ultranationalists dream of creating a worldwide movement. One of the first to congratulate the organization after the US terrorist designation on April 6th was Igor Girkin, a former Russian intelligence officer charged with murder by Dutch authorities in the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in 2014. Girkin also faces sanctions imposed by the United States as well as the European Union. We'll get more into this figure and his ties to RAM. But in short, he played a key role in Russia's annexation of Ukraine and was commander and defense minister in the separatist Ukraine region of Donetsk. So this is the International Center for Counterterrorism publication site. And this is entitled "The Russian Imperial Movement and Its Links to Transnational White Supremacist Extremist Movements." So this reiterates what we've already seen, that the US State Department designated RAM as a terrorist entity. What's significant is that it marked the first time that the US Department has designated a white supremacist extremist organization as such. Discussing the background in past activity, this again discusses some of the broader concepts of far-right extremist Russian nationalism that we've touched upon. It also calls out the Russian Orthodox Church. We're going to see that there is a specific paramilitary tied to Russian Orthodox religion. But not skipping ahead too far, I want to look at the end of this paragraph, which states, "The organization operates 2 paramilitary training facilities in St. Petersburg, through which it offers a training course that RAM calls Partisan. The training program includes instructions in woodland and urban assault, firearms, and other combat skills. RAM has used the facility to train private Russian citizens to fight alongside Ukrainian separatists as part of an affiliated paramilitary unit, the Imperial Legion." RAM is seeking to establish an international network dedicated to defending Western culture. So this goes on to say that there's a fear of full-scale war against traditional values of Western civilization. And in a meeting with the Nordic resistance movement, another white supremacist group, it was stated that the two groups shared a common enemy, the Jewish oligarchs in Ukraine. And so this is important. This is something that's going to come up again and again, is the idea that RAM has training facilities in Russia, in St. Petersburg, and everybody knows this. However, they exist. Everybody also knows that there are white supremacist groups from all over the world coming there to train. Everybody also knows that there were extremists being fed into Donetsk and Luhansk from this training facility as well. And it's been allowed to operate essentially freely as long as it doesn't interfere with internal politics in Russia. Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation has a great site about RAM. And if we scroll down here, it's broken down into profile contents, but I'm going to look at a overview publication that they created. So the name of this publication is Russian Imperial Movement at a Glance, Overview, Organization, Strategy, Major Attacks, Interaction, as well as Maps. And really, I think that this overview is the best overview of the group that I've seen online. The Russian Imperial Movement is an extreme right, white supremacist militant organization based in St. Petersburg, Russia. Founded in 2002, the group promotes ethnic Russian nationalism, advocates the restoration of Russia's czarist regime, and seeks to fuel white supremacy extremism in the West. RAM maintains contacts with neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups across Europe and the United States. The group has provided paramilitary training to Russian nationals and members of like-minded organizations from other countries at its facilities in St. Petersburg. Members of RAM's armed wing, the Imperial Legion, have fought alongside pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine and been involved in conflicts in Libya and Syria. In addition to its ultra-nationalist beliefs, RAM is known for its anti-Semitic and anti-Ukrainian views. The US State Department listed RAM as a specially designated global terrorist organization in April of 2020. It is the first white supremacist group to be designated as such. And so this encapsulates everything. It tells you what the group is, when it formed, what its ideas are, its involvement in Ukraine, specifically in training and facilitating issues in Eastern Ukraine, all the way up to how it was designated as the first white supremacist terrorist group by the United States. So continuing with the Russian Imperial movement, on this slide, I have an overview of some of the things we just talked about, but also the flag. And you'll see variations of this flag. However, you will see the black, yellow, gold, and white in different pictures, social media posts, etc., in areas of Eastern Ukraine. And this is interesting. This is from Radical Russian Imperial Movement Expanding Global Outreach. This is interesting because it discusses Russia's reaction to the United States putting RAM on the terrorist list, essentially. Russian officials have condemned the US embargo on RAM, calling it part of Russophobia of the US establishment. And I think that that's interesting because we see that term also used to describe elements in Ukraine, right? Russophobia. But here's quotes. Since Washington has not substantiated its decision with convincing and detailed information, we have the impression that it was made primarily for propaganda purpose and has little to do with cooperation in countering international terrorism, which is absolutely just objectively ridiculous. That's not my opinion. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman had stated. Below, some experts said Russian intelligence units such as the Federal Security Service are likely aware of RAM activity, but allow it to operate for the short-term benefits. The Kremlin knew what the Russian Imperial movement was doing, and it never hid what they were doing. RAM's recruitment efforts and pledge to send members to combat zones were beneficial to the Kremlin in its aggression against the Ukraine. I'm not going to go over this because it's redundant, but if you are interested, check out the Counter Extremism Project, Russian Imperial Movement. This is a short publication, but it highlights most of the things that we've talked about up to this point regarding RAM. So wrapping up RIM, now, I mean, they're a big one, and so I wanted to spend some time on them, but they're not the only one. However, they are very significant, and they're just absent in the conversation for some reason about extremism in Ukraine in 2022. However, wrapping it up for the purpose of this video, I have a quote here from head of the Sova Center, an anti-extremist organization based in Moscow. When asked, why does the Russian government allow for this to occur? Why is this right-wing extremist group allowed to train not only Russians, but other, white supremacists and other extremists from across the world somewhat openly in St. Petersburg? And he says it's a mystery, but he suggests that the government might be tolerating these mini militias as a mild way to adopt the Donbas veterans without disturbances. And I think that that's a nice way to encapsulate how these groups function within Russia and why they're different than maybe what we see in Ukraine. These groups are recognized in Russia. They operate. They go to war zones such as Syria and Eastern Ukraine. They work alongside with Russian military as well as regional paramilitaries and extremist groups. And what we see here is this kind of social political acceptance of the reality that there are veterans of this movement, that there are people essentially doing the dirty work, and we'll get into more of them, and that they are going to return to Russia. And so that perhaps part of the reason why these places aren't shut down as they should be is that nod and wink acceptance, as opposed to, what we might see happening in Ukraine, in which you have something like the Azov Battalion being essentially like decommissioned, demilitarized, and then brought into the official ranks of the Ukrainian military. So moving on to another very large group. And I think at this point, we need to clarify that kind of like the timeline of events, these groups intermingle at this point. They have different goals and objectives, but they all share general ideas as well, and they collaborate often. So I say that because if you do go out and you look for academic research on this, you might see RNU, or sometimes the abbreviation is RNE, used not interchangeably, but along with RIM. So that having been stated, Russian National Unity is interesting because their Facebook page says that they don't exist anymore, that they've been dissolved, and that's just factually inaccurate. And we know that that's inaccurate because there are images of the group operating in Ukraine within the past few years. So it at least existed during the initial breakaway republics of 2014, 2015 timeline. So RNU, identified by the Association of Jewish Organizations and Communities of Ukraine as a neo-Nazi white supremacist far-right nationalist group. Alexander Barkashov, the head of the neo-Nazi Russian National Unity Party. And you can see there's a screenshot on the right-hand side of this screen from his vk.com account, which is the social media account in Russia. And on his timeline, I looked through it, and of course I had to translate, and oftentimes that translations can be messy, and if there's images posted, propaganda, those aren't going to translate. So I gleaned some things from it, but the most important were the images of RNU in Ukraine. So here we have in August 13, 2014, a subdivision of Russian National Unit somewhere, right? And so to be more specific, it says somewhere near Gorlovka. And Gorlovka is a city, town in Donetsk. Pavel Gubarev, the first governor of the independent Republic of Donetsk, was a member of Russian National Unity. So this article, Neo-Nazi Russian Nationalists, exposes how Russian leaders sent them to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. Quite a title. But anyway, when we get into the meat of this, in this paragraph, both the Ukrainian supporters of Russian world, which is essentially that ideology that we've been discussing, that broad idea, whom Moscow had been cultivating since 2006, and many of the Russian militants in prominent positions or involved in the fighting in Donbass had neo-Nazi or far-right views. Those involved in fighting Ukrainians in Donbass included, and it's the hits, it's these people that we already talked about, the neo-Nazi Russian National Unity Party, Dugan's ultra-nationalist Eurasia Party, and then a new one that we'll get into as well, the Black Hundred. And so this brings it together. When we say mayor, we're using this in air quotes, but in early March 2014, Pavel Gubarev, a Ukrainian from Donetsk with a past in the neo-Nazi Russian National Unity Party, tried to raise a people's uprising in Donetsk and declared himself the people's mayor. The said uprising and the idea that there needed to be a people's mayor closely followed a scenario pushed by the lavishly financed Putin advisor, Sergei Glazev. So we've heard of this person before as well. Gubarev's uprising failed, and even the appearance of so-called tourists, burly Russians brought in to provide the support they couldn't get from local Ukrainians, failed to achieve Moscow's aim. It was only when Igor Girkin, remember him, a Russian former FSB officer, and his heavily armed and trained men arrived in Slavyansk on April 12th, 2014, that parts of Donbass fell to the Russian-controlled militants. So we're starting to see overlap in names and people and groups here, as well as a cohesive ideology. And now we're beginning to see the dominoes fall as well. If you remember earlier, I had stated that there were examples dating all the way back to 2005 of Russian extremist groups eyeing Eastern Ukraine as a potential target. And then we also discussed, kind of alongside the little green men, those Russian soldiers without any insignia on them, the idea that there were these far-right extremist elements, both in Crimea as well as Eastern Ukraine, attempting to stir trouble, to provoke an uprising, leading up to and including 2014. So this paragraph is extremely important because it pulls all of those events together. It's no longer some type of conspiracy. It's actually a historical timeline now of documented events. And going more into this article, in an interview, a supporter of Russian world ideology, Gubarev stated quite clearly that without Russian involvement, there would have been no self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, no so-called Russian Spring in Donetsk and Luhansk, and that any uprising would have died the same death that it did in Odessa and Kharkiv. Gubarev admits it was Gherkin and his heavily armed men, Russians, who were able to drag the uprising out of a usual unarmed and toothless street protest. And so this is important, not to try to indict Russia on anything. That's not the point of this. This is important from a examination of far-right nationalist movements and their involvement in Ukraine, because it shows coordination between Russian military efforts, or at least strategic aims, with these extremist groups. So this goes on to talk about another individual who I have not, to be transparent, looked into much, Alexander Zhukovsky, who holds openly neo-Nazi Russian nationalist views, according to this. So he's interesting because he published a book entitled 85 Days in Slavyansk. And I would like to read this. I have not read this yet, but apparently within this book, he talks openly about Russia's role in the early stages of the breakaway of Donetsk and Luhansk. But going down a little bit further, another of the first Russian leaders of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, also admitted that without Russia's military intervention, he and other insurgents would be dead. Since he, as well as other former militants, are likely to win places in Russia's State Duma shortly, it's worth noting that there are also intercepted calls which prove that he and other militant leaders were in fact always following orders from Moscow. So again, not trying to indict Moscow in any of this, but what we're showing is that unlike the situation again in Ukraine, where you had a basically group of football ultras and neo-Nazis come together, and they call them volunteer forces, but it's basically somewhere between a gang and the paramilitary. They were financed by an oligarch for a while, the Azov group, wherever you want to call them. And then having that get rolled into the official Ukrainian military, that's very point A to point B and very easy to see. What we have going on with Russia is equal, if not more, really, when you're looking at the impact of these groups on the early breakaway republics in Luhansk and Donetsk. We see these extremist groups existing there as well, however, in a more clandestine nature. Now we'll see coming up that some of this is much more in your face. But to this point, this is one of the big differences when you're trying to discuss, Russia and Ukraine, being just transparent and honest about it. And that's why perhaps it's easier, or maybe why you see more things about Ukraine on social media, because you only have a certain amount of characters, images are impactful. And so it's just easier to tie those connections. I don't know, that's an opinion. However, but just building on that, this is the individual Alexander Borodai. The topic is terrorism. Title: Former Donbass militant leader admits republics exist because of Putin and Russia. I'm not going to say that's biased, obviously. However, it is just important to know that what the previous article had stated, that there was this militant leader that was openly discussing Russia's role, and even perhaps for participating within these uprisings, that there might be a reward. And this is just kind of showing that, right? Boring that out. Former Donbass militant leader admits republics exist because of Putin and Russia here. And there is a link to the individual stating or making these statements as well. So it's not something that's open and easy to find, but link from the article, there is a mashup of the individual stating his interaction with Moscow, as well as these ideas of maybe receiving a government position or appointment for participation in Donbass. However, not everything is clandestine and linked to mashup videos. Euromaidan Press has an article, it's back from 2014. A Nazi division from Russia is fighting in Ukraine and continues to recruit. And here we see the insignia or the flag. Nazis from the Russian National Unity, RNE, a far-right radical organization, is at war in Ukraine. As the RNE's leader, Alexander, who we've talked about this individual already, Barkashov reported on his VK page on August 13th. That's the same screenshot that I had on the previous slide. The members of the Russian National Unity are known in Russia for wearing wristbands with swastikas and using the Nazi greeting. And actually, we can scroll up here, and in the image, you can see the salute right there, Sig Heil. Their ideology is based on racial and national intolerance, as well as anti-Semitism. Everything that we described at the top of this video. It goes on to say that the goals of the group, they're against satanic plans of the USA, against the global Jewish plot, free Masonic Jewry, the invisible hand of Jewish manipulators. So, you know, we get the idea here. Alexander's page, they're talking about the vk.com, the social media account that he posts on, announces an ongoing draft into divisions of Russian national unity, and it displays a frightening mix of religious fanaticism and nationalistic expansionism. And here is his page. You can link to it. This is open to investigate. And so this is just one image that I found on his page, just to show again that flag and the insignia of this group. This, again, to bring it all together, is the same person that was describing how he was outside of that city near Donetsk with his troops back in 2014. Some more images from his photos. So this news article, Russian ultranationalists come to fight in Ukraine. Going down again, here's the same group, and you can see the logo as well. What's significant with this, though, okay, and this is how RNU meetings look. People are giving the Nazi salute. But what's interesting here is when we get down to the bottom, Russian separatists through Twitter have been called upon to sabotage Ukrainian police. The party stated in late February a sign-up campaign for Russian tourists to Crimea in case of a sudden onset of the tourist season. This is what was meant in the previous article when we were talking about tourists and burly Russian men, I believe was the phrase used. This was code used on social media to advertise and to get people to join. So Russian national unity provides literal images of folks inside Eastern Ukraine, as well as the ties that I think we're missing when we're talking about maybe RIM to the Russian government. Now, I mean, those ties most likely exist if RM is continued to be allowed to train in St. Petersburg. However, that's speculation. And with the Russian national unity, that it's not speculation, it's documented. And so that's the difference with these two organizations. So, I wasn't sure if I was going to separate out the Russian Orthodox Army from RNU or not, because they're somewhat synonymous. They're very closely tied, but I did, in order to, I guess, organize these different groups. So another faction within this far right nationalism of Russia and presence in Eastern Ukraine is Russian Orthodox Army. It was founded in 2014 in reaction to what was happening in Donbass. It's closely tied to the RNU. It has been involved in documented instances of kidnapping and torture, and it's held trainings with German right-wing extremists. So this is from Charisma News. The title of this article is "Quoting Old Testament, New Pro-Russia Militia Group Lines Up in Ukraine." So this is a quote from a member of the Russian Orthodox Army, nicknamed Chrome. Of course, people aren't going to give their real names for these things. "We are Russians, and we will take revenge for everything the Ukrainians have done to us. We will be here until the very end." Chrome and his 24 comrades on the barricade are part of a new pro-Moscow unit formed 3 months ago, calling itself Russian Orthodox Army, and has been engaged in the heaviest fighting against Ukraine's army in the Donetsk region for this month. The Russian Orthodox Army's barricade, made of sandbags, trucks, and hunks of concrete, now sits between residential blocks in the city, significantly raising the risk of civilian casualties in the event of fighting. And this is a very important part here as well. Sergei said that his men were also in control of the Ukrainian Security Service building in Donetsk, and that he is appointed commander by the separatist top military figure, Igor Strelkov, a Muscovite. So that's the code name for Gherkin. And you recall him from many of the previous articles when we were talking about Russian unity and his connections to official military and government in Ukraine, or excuse me, in Russia. This article is especially interesting because it talks about an event at the Donetsk airport, which is somewhat infamous when you begin researching, I guess, early flashpoints of violence in Donbass region, but also because it goes on to show how this group worked hand in hand with pro-Russian forces, one of them being Battalion Vostok, or the East Battalion. It talks about the composition of these battalions. Later in Donetsk on Thursday, rebels said the bodies of some volunteers from Russia killed this week in the airport fighting were being prepared to be returned to Russia. And so on the slide, it claimed that this group has been involved in human rights violations. And so this is just one case. This is a PDF entitled Ukraine 2014 International Religious Freedom Report. And so going down in the Ukraine section, it says, on July 3rd, Donetsk People's Republic, or DPR, gunmen describing themselves as the Russian Orthodox Army kidnapped UGCC priest. His captors reportedly subjected him to repeated mock executions, took away his medications, threatening him with a slow death unless he joined the Russian Orthodox Church. He also sustained physical injuries before his eventual release on July 14th. And so there are more, but if you want to take a look at this PDF, it's on the US Department of State site, Diplomacy in Action, under quick links for Ukraine. And so to tie the Russian Orthodox Army into some of the earlier discussions, this is actually an article entitled Why Are German Neo-Nazis Training in Russia?, which ties back to RIM training in St. Petersburg, which we already discussed. But I think that there's a ideological tie here when we start talking about Orthodox religion. And so doing a keyword search down below, who conducts the paramilitary training? It says the training center and club organizers have very close ties to Russia's Christian Orthodox extremists. And who are those Christian Orthodox extremists? Well, the Russian Orthodox Army, of course. And so just also interesting to note, especially, or I should say specifically with the Russian Orthodox Army, I found a lot of what could only be described as like hype videos on YouTube with them. Now, RIM is also involved, Russian Unity too. There are things up there, but specifically the Russian Orthodox Army had, you could almost call them like infomercials, just short videos showing acts of war, which are supposedly their members in action with like EDM music on top of it. On this slide, you can see some of the reactions to them. And of course, I just included the based comments because of course it ties it kind of to like US 4chan right-wing extremist lingo. But I also have some screenshots of Russian identity, Russian unity patch. That was an interesting video with Russian Nazi remembered in coup depth. So there's a large online presence. One video, the RAM, is linked to Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine and bomb attack in Sweden. That was right around when they were labeled a domestic or a foreign, terrorist organization. So I just wanted to show this because there are things that you can find out there. The Orthodox Army one, I felt was especially, I guess troublesome would be the word, because it looked like advertising. It looked like hype videos. So the next group that we're going to talk about is the Wagner Group, or Wagner Group, I suppose, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's a Russian private military company. It was present in the Donbass region of 2014 and 2015, and members have posted images linked to RAM and neo-Nazi groups, as you can see on this slide here. And so this group is somewhat controversial. It's one that pro-Russian sources will say doesn't even exist. However, it clearly does. And this is from MEMRI, Domestic and Transnational Terrorism Threat Monitor. And this is February 2022. So fairly recent to the creation of this video. So just first a brief overview. I'm not going to read this line by line, but the Wagner Group is a private military company or PMC with links to various people. This says Russian businessmen and calls out specific individuals, but also Russian government too. Mercenaries from the group have fought in civil wars in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. The group is linked to GRU and is reliant on Russian military infrastructure. Wagner mercenaries have been reported in Ukraine, as well as, and it lists many other conflict zones. The Wagner Group seems to have deployed in Ukraine based on social media posts of accounts with links to the group and past activities of the group in Eastern Ukraine. The PMC is equipped with standard Russian military equipment and has used runes and other symbols popular among neo-Nazi groups. So let's scroll down and look at some of the social media posts. Okay, so this is February 23rd, 2022. It is a Twitter account which appears to be affiliated with the Wagner Group, showing preparation to go into Ukraine. The group first posted an image of a Russian surface-to-air missile system inscribed with Nordic runes and the Z symbol. The Z symbol has been widely used by Russian forces to denote reservist or irregular units, such as the Wagner Group. The tweet notes that the runes symbolize the connection to the god of war, right? So long story short, some Russian nationalist stuff. But going down, we see the image of the runes on the side of the surface-to-air missile unit, as well as the Z on the top of it. Here, I'll make this bigger if you're watching the video. Here we go. Okay. A white supremacist Telegram channel also shared screenshots from Twitter that read, "Are you ready?" And then also, this is from the group's Telegram channel as well, showing fighting again. And more. So, you know, long story short, what this article is pointing out are the social media posts created by the group. It's tying some of the symbols to neo-Nazi stuff too, but I think what's equally as important is the documentation that the group is operating within Eastern Ukraine. And so this is a Guardian article, so pretty mainstream media stuff here. Russian mercenaries in Ukraine linked to far-right extremists. Wagner Group connected to white supremacists. Tech against terrorism investigation finds. I tried to find the Tech Against Terrorism initial report to share that, and I wasn't able to. I did reach out to them on Twitter, though. They have a Twitter account to see if I was just doing something wrong. They have a website that you can log on to and search for things. Maybe you have to be some type of member or something, but I wasn't able to find this specific one. However, it does exist, and they the Tech Against Terrorism's Twitter page actually posted this article. So the article goes on to state that Russian mercenaries fighting in Ukraine, including the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group, have been linked to far-right extremists, including an organization designated by the US as terrorists, analysts reveal. Although Vladimir Putin says his special military operation is aimed at denazification of Ukraine, an investigation has found links between pro-Russian forces and violent right-wing extremism, including those directly affiliated with Wagner. One post on the message app Telegram dated March 15th shows a flag of the Russian Imperial movement, RIM. So we've discussed them. That's the black, yellow, gold, white flag. A white supremacist paramilitary organization, which the US lists as terrorists allegedly flown by Moscow-backed separatists in Donetsk. The post was shared by a pro-Putin channel. Much of the extremist content posted on Telegram and the Russian social media platform VK, which we were on before, relates to a far-right unit within the Wagner Group called Rusich, with other links to pro-Kremlin online communities. And we're going to get to Rusich in a moment. And so this is a social media post. I'm always weary of these. I prefer to stick to research, .edu sites, but I've seen it widely circulated, and I'm going to roll with it, especially the image on the left. That seems to be verified. The image on the right to me looks a little blurry. I mean, it could be this individual, but I'm not going to say that it was. However, regardless, this is the purported chief of the Wagner Group. Here says hired to denazify Ukraine. That's kind of playing on President Putin's justification for the invasion of Ukraine. The Wagner Group in general has been described as Putin's private army, as it is a private military unit. Dmitry Utkin, the individual that we see here, is the leader, or the purported leader, of this group. It was called the Wagner, or the Wagner Group, as I've been saying, as an ode to the German composer of Richard Wagner, of course, for whom Hitler was a big fan of. The Russian investigative news service, and I'm going to do my best with pronunciation, Fontanka, called Utkin a neo-Nazi, and as evidence showed images of him shirtless in the report, and that's where this image came from. On the left-hand side, you can see some of the Nazi images on his tattoos, but also just the whole idea of the group being called the Wagner Group as well. So that previous article that we were looking at talked about the Telegram channel and how a lot of the extremist content on it related to the Wagner Group was associated with another group kind of underneath that military structure called the Rusich Group. And This is the Rusich group here, a Russian neo-Nazi mercenary unit accused of multiple war crimes in Donbass. Members documented in Syrian action as well, posing with Nazi salutes and other Nazi paraphernalia. The commander in Donbass photographed with Nazi paraphernalia, and that's used on the image of this slide here. And I think that this is what people want to see. You know, with Azov in Ukraine, and honestly, when you're stepping back and looking at it, it's a portion of one battalion, but in that battalion, the swastikas are prevalent, and so that's the easy go-to, right? Up to this point, there's been lots of ideas, ideologies. You know, we've seen these groups, RMI and Russian Unity, and their symbols, and the fact that they've been on the ground and collaborating with Russian political and military authorities. But you know, people want to see that swastika when we're talking about far right extremism and fascism. And so here it finally is, with this group operating underneath the Wagner Group's substructure as the Rusich. And so here we are with this article: commander of Donetsk People's Republic, fascists from the DSHRG or Rusich. Residents of Donetsk should be sent for meat. The head of the terrorist DSHDR Rusich, Alexei Milkovac, arrived and occupied Donetsk and assessed the situation of the city. And so this is the individual that was on the slide. In an interview with the separatist channel Novorossiya, Milkovac criticized the men of Donetsk for not all of them wanting to fight with the militants. According to Milkovac, such people who are trying to escape from the war should be mobilized in the DPR by force. What to say to these people? They ran away from this summer. Many, they came back. They live as if nothing had happened. He goes on to say the men should be ashamed. He continues to criticize them. In an interview with the separatist channel Novorossiya, Milkovac criticized the men of Donetsk for not all of them wanting to fight with the militants. According to Milkovac, such people who are trying to escape from the war should be mobilized in the Donetsk People's Republic by force. The article goes on to say it should be noted that Milkovac does not hide his fascist ideology at all. In one of the social networks, there are photos of him with an eloquent flag, the Nazi flag. In addition, the terrorist is prone to killing animals and sadism. In one of the photos, he is captured with the head of a dog. There's also images of him apparently holding a severed ear from a Ukrainian militant as well. And this is from the article, What is Task Force Rusich? Inside Russia's most vicious neo-Nazi mercenary unit. With a subtitle, the Task Force Rusich might have accidentally revealed plans of entering Ukraine on social media. The Task Force Rusich is one of the most feared and dreaded paramilitary groups of Russia. They have been earlier accused of committing war crimes in Ukraine. The Task Force Rusich is a Russian mercenary unit that seems to take pride in their reputation as a neo-Nazi group known for merciless brutality. The Task Force Rusich first came into public limelight back in 2014 when they were deployed in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine during the peak fighting period between Russian separatist forces and Ukrainian military. Their deployment, which also happened to be their first, spread terror and fear in the populace, claims witnesses, as the unrest spread. In September of 2014, Rusich had attacked a column of Ukrainian volunteer fighters near the Donbass town of Metalist, killing dozens, according to Ukrainian news reports. Local sources also said that the Rusich had mutilated the corpses and set them on fire. Images of the shocking events later went on to become part of the group's mythos. Mutilation of corpses is also something that follows this group. There are accusations of this with their actions in Syria as well. Throughout their 2014 and 2015 deployment, Milkovac, the guy that we saw with the swastika, and other Rusich members courted infamy, posting images of atrocities and selfies with dead bodies, according to Ukrainian media. Human rights groups in Ukraine accused the Rusiks of brutally torturing prisoners of war. The Rusiks withdrew from Ukraine in 2015 and reappeared in Syria to protect Russian-owned oil and gas infrastructure. Posts made on their Instagram accounts showed group members posing with a Nazi salute in front of central ruins located in the Palmyra. Throughout their 2014 and 2015 deployment, Milkovac, the guy that we saw with the swastika, and other Rusich members courted infamy. And this paragraph goes on to describe what that infamy is, mostly war crimes, images of body parts, and other dismemberment. And, you know, I'm a little surprised. And, you know, I'm a little surprised with this group. It seems as if there's widespread attention given to it. This is Daily Beast, so this is pretty mainstream. Neo-Nazi Russian attack unit hints it's going back to Ukraine. And this is recent. This is from January 26, 2022. One of the most notorious battalions of the secretive and deadly Wagner Group appeared to suggest it's preparing to return to Ukraine, raising the prospect of a Russian assault. And this is right before all this escalation happened with Russia. And so now we're kind of in the heart of this, showing direct ties with these Russian extremist groups, some of them operating independently, some of them operating with state-sponsored materials, weapons, cash, and some of them working with government officials. So this is another group called the Black Hundred. And now Black Hundreds, there's a historical group that's not necessarily related to this. Black Hundred is a Russian nationalist extremist group that's worked in collaboration with Russian secret services. Members arrested in Ukraine for organizing paramilitaries and spreading anti-Semitic and anti-Ukrainian literature. In the image here, we have one of its members, Alexander Shilmark, and you can see that he has a Nazi swastika tattoo on his arm. So this is going back to that earlier paper that discussed both the Ukrainian as well as Russian extremists and their involvement with Ukraine. The fact that many far-right fighters were serving in the military shortly before the conflict began also supports the supposition that the radical nationalist activities on Ukrainian territory were coordinated with Russian secret services. Anton Ravitsky, a member of the Black Hundreds, may serve as a prime example. In March 2014, he was working with his brother in arms to prepare a pro-Russian armed uprising in Odessa before joining up with other fighters in the Donbass. The neo-Nazi from St. Petersburg, so this is the head of the Rusich that we were just looking at, Alexei Milkovic, known for his brutal reprisals against injured Ukrainian servicemen, might also serve as an example. Although Milkovic got involved in the conflict once military operations had already begun, he apparently entered the Ukrainian territory at the head of the pre-formed and armed Rusich Assault Sabotage Reconnaissance Unit, the backbone of which was composed of professional soldiers with far-right views. So in that paper, it talked about Anton Ravitsky, and I did find some images of him. Now, this is not about his time in Donbass. This is about his time in Odessa, but it has images and links him to the Black Hundred and describes it as a neo-Nazi organization. The title of this, In Odessa, in separatist rallies take part neo-Nazi from St. Petersburg. It's probably a little messed up because it's been translated into English. But okay, so Anton Revitsky, so here are images of him. Here he's at a protest talking about Russia and how it should intervene in Ukraine. Here it states he is a member of the neo-Nazi movement in Russia called the Black Hundred. Their flags were seen during separatist rallies in Odessa. And then just some more images from his social media. And from Euromaidan Press, the Black Hundreds, the most important Russian group now active in Ukraine. And we have an image of a protest in Donetsk, I believe. Let's see. And pro-Russian separatist demonstration in Luhansk, okay, Eastern Ukraine. An unidentified speaker went straight for the jugular. The Maidanists say, we've had a revolution of national liberation. And I ask, which nation? Let's see how many Ukrainians have come to power. The speaker paused and the crowd called out, he is a Jew. The speaker continued to list major Ukrainian politicians, adding their alleged Jewish names to prove their true origin. The speaker then goes on to say, this is a coup perpetrated by Zionists, and the crowd bursts into applause. To tie this into that concept of Russian imperialism that we started with, it states the Black Hundreds and other similar groups, of which there are many, do not recognize the existence of a Ukrainian nation. There is only one Russian, one Slavic nation. So that speaks to the heart of, that fascism for fascists, the Russian reconception of far-right extremism that we talked about at the top of the video. And in this article, again about Anton Revitsky, activist of national radical group Black Hundred. In late March, law enforcement officers in Odessa detained Anton Revitsky, a Russian citizen and activist of the national radical group Black Hundred. The ultra-right-wing activist proudly posing with neo-Nazi tattoos. There's a link, and it's the image that's actually on the slide from the PowerPoint. And his arm thrown up as well, giving a Nazi salute. Took part in the organization of the Odessa Squad, a separatist paramilitary formation. According to SBU, the young man, on the instructions of Russian specialist forces, made efforts to destabilize the situation in the region and organize preparations for the invasion of Russian troops. Anton Revitsky himself even confessed to his intention to kill the leader of the Odessa branch of Right Sector. And Right Sector, we covered in the Azov Battalion video. Those are far right-wing extremist groups in Ukraine. And so interesting to tie that last article to this. The detainee was found to have materials inciting ethnic hatred and calling for violence against Ukrainians and Jews. According to some sources, it was a group of separatists and Russian national radicals led by Revitsky who used Jewish symbols, Israeli flags with the inscription Russia Protect, and Jewish insurgent army during mass demonstrations for provocative purposes. So that's what we just saw, right? The speakers from this group Black Hundred talking about how this was a Zionist coup, how the leaders of Ukraine are no longer actually Ukrainians, but instead Jewish, with the idea, and you're listening to this saying, well, yeah, they're Jewish Ukrainians, so what? But this is through a far-right extremist viewpoint that we discussed at the top of uniting I guess you could say Slavic peoples, but I wouldn't even say that because that might be misinterpreted. But uniting people from this region, right? Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, if you want to get into the Eurasian side of it too, spanning into Asia. But the idea that these borders are artificial, and that moving beyond, again, that kind of the Bolshevikism steeped in scientific socialism or material history, the basics of Marxism, that now you've moved past that. And what you're looking at instead is religion, culture, race, ethnicity, right? So this is tying it all together. And Black Hundred was part of those early groups that we discussed at the top, who went into Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, to stir trouble. So this is one of the viewpoints, right? One of the avenues that was used. And just stepping back even from this article and extrapolating, this is when it gets a little complicated when you're talking to people online, or just people for whom you're unsure of what their motivations are. Because, for instance, there could be people who aren't necessarily right-wing, white nationalist, neo-Nazi extremists that would say, for instance, that the European Union is bad, and maybe that might be for many reasons. It could be about state sovereignty. It could be about trade. It could be about capitalism, exploitation, etc. However, from this viewpoint, right? And so that's one discussion that you might be having with a stranger. But another discussion that you might be having with a stranger is from this Russian white supremacist, neo-Nazi type point of view, in which you're looking through the lens of perhaps NATO, perhaps EU, perhaps UN, all these international, anything international, because anything international ties into old anti-Semitic tropes, right, about Jewish people and conspiracies. So you could potentially also be having a discussion with someone who's acting in bad faith, presenting as a person with legitimate concerns over maybe NATO, for instance, right? However, what they're actually engaging in is this type of racism, right? This type of extremism, in which they're saying, well, Maidan, or the Maidan protests, were a coup, right? And you could say it was a coup of the West, right? But I mean, the West and Jew is very easily interchangeable, and so that's why some of these methods of radicalization are effective. And we can see here the Black Hundred doing that. And in the previous article, the reception that I had, at least with that crowd in Luhansk. I do feel as if it would be something of a lie by omission if I didn't say this. I've made a video on Azov, and now I've made a video on Russian extremists in Ukraine as well. But really on either side, for this video, we'll stick with Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk. But the composition of fighters, especially at the beginning, not so much now, but especially in the beginning of the conflict, was truly just a mixture. And on here, I just have some things like Ukrainians and then Russians and Chechens, foreign mercenaries, foreign ideologues. In the Azov Battalion video, I discuss how Al Jazeera had early interviews with Azov in Mariupol, and members saying, yeah, around like 25% of the battalion are actual Nazis and believe this stuff, and the rest are paid mercenaries. So it's also true for that in Donbass as well. So what I don't want to do is in focusing on extremism in these breakaway republics, I don't want to overstate it either. In either case, whether you're talking about Ukraine or you're talking about Eastern Ukraine and Russia's involvement, these people are there. However, these people are not the majority in either. And that's just the truth. And it's a mixture. And you do have people of different ideologies, of some type of Bolshevikism, fighting with people of ideologies of fascism under a flag for which maybe neither agree. And to prove that, I'll show you an interview with someone who actually fought there. But conversely, with Azov, there were also people that were just getting paid, and mercenaries that were involved, and the flag didn't matter. And so I think that when we're, especially in social media, that people look for quick answers, they look for symbols, and they look for narratives or angles to prove something, and everyone has something to prove for whatever reason. But I think that the truth and the reality is much more complicated than just saying these are Nazis and those are Nazis, or there's more Nazis here and there's more Nazis there. I don't think that exercise is useful, to be honest. At best, it's misinformed and maybe in between best and worst. It might be a half truth or maybe biased. And then at worst, it's actually just state propaganda as well. So regardless of what we're talking about, and it's also true for Russia too, the composition of fighters is very much mixed. And as this war has gone on both sides, these extremist elements have either been absorbed into military units and therefore, had greater oversight and regulation placed on them, or they've kind of slipped off and moved into other realms. And so here's just one example to show how these things get complicated. The quote is, "We fought together, communist and Nazi alike, for the liberation of Russia." That might just make your head explode, but war is complicated. Underneath the quote, "Spaniards arrested for fighting in Ukraine say many other foreigners are at the front." So this article is about these Spanish fighters that went to Ukraine. They're aged 24, 27, and 28. One was unemployed, one was a nightclub doorman, and the other worked for Mercedes, the car company. They all lived in Madrid, but they met on the front in Ukraine as part of the pro-Russian Donbas International Brigades. They had arrived there after a 3-day journey last summer, each traveling separately. One went directly to Donetsk, and the other two made a stopover in Moscow, where a Russian government worker was waiting for them. The trio all used the same method of self-enlistment. They contacted Russian combatants via Twitter, according to sources in the investigation that led to their arrest on Friday. The article goes on to say, they were paid neither travel expenses nor salary, but they were received with open arms by the Russian commanders in charge on the Ukraine Eastern Front. They were armed, given weapons. They go on to say that they lived in collective barracks where they say there are still more Spanish brigade members and several hundred from other countries, above all Serbia and France. So quotes from one of these individuals: "Half of them are communists and the other half are Nazis," they explained. "We fought together, communists and Nazi alike. We all want the same: social justice and liberation of Russia from the Ukrainian invasion." I'm not going to parse that or dissect that. I chose this, one, to show, just forget about people in Russia. I mean, just the idea of international brigades in general and ideologues moving in to fight, but also just to show how, unlike on social media, when we're having these discussions and debates, or maybe even in person, right? Life is not so compartmentalized and easy to explain. This, what I just read, coming from a historical, political science point of view, makes my head spin, and I'm not going to attempt to dissect it. But I think it's important to realize, right, especially when we're getting emotionally involved in this and debating on different spaces, that the reality is very often not as clean and clear cut as we would like it to be, or perhaps as we are presenting it in our sentences and in our however many characters that we can fit onto Twitter. And to also kind of just prove a point here, because I do prefer using academic sources and then, kind of on top of those, going out, finding articles from the time period, etc. But in academia, or even social media, we could say debating and stuff, this idea of making systems, making things neat and compartmentalized, it just isn't true with war. And this is another article I found that kind of describes this. ATO forces detained a Nazi from Russia. Okay, so this is someone from Russia. They detained him. You can see, yeah, that's a Nazi tattoo. All right, but when you scroll down though, okay, it says on the morning of June 14th, fighters of the 8th Company, Arata, of the Volunteer Ukrainian Corps Right Sector. Okay, it goes on to say also Chechen Battalion. Okay, well, first, yeah, I mean, people forget that Chechens are, might be involved in this too, but right sector. If now I don't know, but if this is the right sector that I'm thinking of, okay, right sector are not good people either. Those are, if this volunteer Ukrainian Corps right sector is also right sector in terms of like the political organizations in Ukraine, then these are far right wing, potentially neo-Nazi, white supremacist, horrible people as well, right? So we have up here a Russian guy with this on his back, not great, right? It's a swastika with the eagle. It's a Nazi German thing. However, he was captured and detained by the volunteer corps in the Ukraine military right sector. And if right sector is the right sector, I think right sector is not very good. It's basically similar to Azov battalion. It's different, I know, but politically, it's a conglomeration of very, very far right nationalist groups in Ukraine. And so to prove the point, also going down here, they have Russian passport, Russian documentation, etc. And so, it serves this video because here you go, right? It's an extremist from Russia in Ukraine, but it also goes to show how just messy and complicated these things are. Potentially the people who captured him themselves are extremists too. So the last thing that I'd say about this is that just because a battalion or people in the military, just because they don't have a flag with a swastika on it, or just because they don't have some coded lingo or something on their uniform, it doesn't mean that they're good people. Okay, so this person wasn't walking around with an RAM flag, right? Or this person wasn't walking around like the commander in the Rusich with a Nazi flag, right? This is a tattoo they had underneath his clothing. And honestly, who knows how many of these people are involved in the legitimate, not all these kind of like right-wing paramilitary groups that we've been discussing, but just in the legitimate, militaries of both Ukraine and Russia. Lastly, and there's more, but I wanted to bring up the Sparta Battalion because there's articles out there that describe this as a neo-Nazi battalion, and that the leader up here, that he is a neo-Nazi. But I couldn't verify that. I couldn't find any actual evidence to support that aside from the articles describing him and this group as that. So I'm not going to say that they are, but I'm just going to include this in the video because it's out there. I checked out the emblem that they have, that patch. It's actually tied to a video game, and it's not. It gets weird, but it's not like a Nazi thing, at least to my knowledge. So I just put this here because there's articles, and you might come across that and say, oh, here's another one. They might be, but I at least in the time frame that I gave myself to conduct research for this, I couldn't find anything to verify that. If you do, leave it down in the comments or put it up on my Twitter page, because I'd be interested. I had a time frame to conduct this research, and I'm up against it. So I wanted to incorporate them again, because there's some pretty mainstream articles out there that talk about them and describe them as neo-Nazis, but I didn't see anything outside of those articles. Like I didn't see a link to something else that proved that. Section 3, broader Russian support. I'm actually going to, I'm just going to briefly touch upon this. I'm not going to go too in depth, because I feel like this is already at a pretty good length, and this could be potentially a separate topic on its own. But just some things just to put out there. Broader Russian support. So Nordic Resistance Movement is one that we mentioned. They did direct training with RIM in St. Petersburg, and members later did attempt to detonate bombs. So they are tied to RIM, and part of that bombing in Sweden, it played into how the United States ended up labeling RIM itself as a terrorist organization, the first white supremacist terrorist organization they've done. Atomwaffen with an M as well, I found, and then the base. And I'm going to hold off on the base, because there's an interesting component to this too, with RAM, another movement too. The base having ties to Russia, but RAM having ties to Ukraine and Azov. And so I'm considering maybe seeing what's out there on that. And if content exists, I'll just share what's out there. But if nothing exists, maybe I'll create content too. But the idea behind initially including this is that not only is there this kind of paramilitary assistance for white supremacists and neo-Nazis worldwide through training within Russia, but with the base and some other groups, there's actually some interesting evidence to suggest perhaps that there's Russian government involvement too. I'm stopping there though, because I haven't done that research, and I'm not going to make claims that I can't support. I feel like that's beyond the scope of this video. So I'm just going to leave this here for now and come back to it in the future. And so that brings us to conclusions. And first of all, a conclusion is that there's other groups that we didn't have time to touch upon. There are also very confusing groups that combine different forms of fascism with Bolshevikism. This is a rabbit hole, right? And I'm not going to go down it for the purpose of this specific video. But what I'll say is this, that I think that after looking at the evidence, reading, looking at some research, not only from academics, but also news of the time, 2014, that it is clear that there were definitely Russian right-wing extremists, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, imperialists, a whole gamut of ideologies that overlap, involved in not only the fighting in Donbass after that broke out, but also in stoking or provoking, attempting to create a situation in which there would be violence in the region as well. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that I also think, after looking at the research, that these groups did collaborate with the regional governments, and those regional governments coordinated directly with Russian government. So, you know, we might talk about like the Wagner or Wagner Group as being specific to having specific ties to official people within the Russian military or government. Without even going down that road, just the fact that it was recognized these groups were there, and that people who are members of these groups were training, fighting, participating in activism, in some cases participating in regional government as well, proves that either directly or indirectly, there was Russian involvement. And I don't mean just Russia broadly, I'm saying specifically the government. There was Russian involvement in this. There was awareness of what was happening. Now, to what degree? Well, that is going to be left open to interpretation, I'm sure, with differing opinions. But it is true. I think we can say it's a true statement to say that there were Russian extremists in eastern Ukraine before these regions broke away. There were Russian extremists in Ukraine fighting with these groups, in some cases training these groups. And it's also true to say that there were Russian extremists interacting and collaborating with these regional governments. I think that it might be more subjective or more inconclusive, but I think it's fair to say that there is also indirect Russian government involvement, even if it is just allowing it to occur, such as that training with RIM in St. Petersburg. Even if it's not proactive, if it's actually the opposite and saying, well, we are aware that there are these far right-wing extremist groups in Russia going into Ukraine and fighting in civil war, and we're not going to do anything about that, right? So where you fit on the gamut of that spectrum of possibilities, that's beyond the scope of this video. This video is just to prove the existence of these groups, first and foremost. Another subjective opinion that I've formed after doing this research and looking at some ideas from Ukrainian extremists. So an opinion that I formed, although I feel like it's an educated opinion, after looking at not just the groups and the symbols, but getting into the ideas behind these groups that we started with, that there is cross-pollination of messaging from these groups, talking about kind of general Russian imperialism, the idea that boundaries and lines of state sovereignty are kind of subjective or made up, and that there's a greater people, right? But after reading some of these ideologies and ideas, and then listening to some of the justifications from Russian governments, there is some cross-pollination there. There is definitely there are themes involved with delegitimizing Ukraine as a sovereign state that I think go beyond just maybe like World War II and Soviet Union borders. It feels like that might be part of it, and that's a theme that people talk about. Putin is trying to reconstitute the boundaries of the USSR. Well, I don't know, maybe, but I think that after doing this research, what I find equally as plausible or at least intriguing is this cross-pollination between these Russian imperialist movements that have all these different elements to them of racism and homophobia and Islamophobia and all these different forms of prejudice, but how it's represented within this broader idea of Belarus, Russia, Ukraine being of one people, and even anti-Semitic tropes being involved with that, showing like a usurpation of power, and then how these anti-Semitic tropes get projected out onto global organizations like NATO or the United Nations or the European Union, right? How all of this stuff can be mixed into a presentation that I feel like I've seen from the Russian government, with just this idea of delegitimizing Ukraine as a sovereign state, and how all that other stuff, right, can stem either from that or can be incorporated into that. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. I don't think that there's any cohesive state government propaganda plan to proliferate the ideas of the Russian Orthodox army or something. But I just find it interesting how at a very general high level, there are similar ideas, right, that are shared across this spectrum of very, very far right neo-Nazis to official kind of state propaganda. All that having been said, I think just maybe the last observation I have is that what's represented in Ukraine is much more linear. It's much easier to identify than perhaps what's happening in Eastern Ukraine. However, what's happening in Eastern Ukraine, in many ways, one could argue these groups had a much greater influence in the events than the events that occurred within the boundaries of Ukraine. And I'm going to jump to something to support that in a moment. But there is this chasm. There's this gap between Azov Battalion and Ukrainian fascism, and then Russian fascism and fascism in Donbass region. And I don't know why. However, I find that gap, at least in social media, to be intriguing, because I want to know why that gap exists. I mean, RIM was designated a terrorist organization under the Trump administration not too long ago. And you would think that, something like that, forget everything else, you would think that something like that would be like common knowledge. But at least in my interactions and what I see when I do searches on search engines and what pops up and what happens in interpersonal exchanges with people, that's not the case. And so I'm going to wrap it up with this this paper I've been using throughout. It was very helpful. On the whole, members of far-right groups played a much greater role on the Russian side of the conflict than on the Ukrainian side, especially at the beginning. Whether this role was decisive is difficult to say. At the very least, it was noticeable. We might speculate that the anti-terror operation would have proceeded at roughly the same speed whether Azov and DUK-PS were involved or not. It is hardly likely, however, that the Kremlin-inspired separatist rebellion in Donbass would have played out in the way it did had Russian extreme nationalists not taken part. So long story short, what this is saying is that what eventually occurred in Ukraine, maybe, this is talking about Azov, but I mean, let's go earlier. Revolution of Dignity, right? Maybe that period, that it wasn't, like Azov that caused that. Now that gets complicated, right? There's some biased opinions and takes on that too. However, even so, after the Maidan protests and after Revolution of Dignity, there was an election, right? And there actually have been two elections. So it isn't as if Azov it caused that, let's say, right? What the author is saying here, though, is that without the assistance from Russia, both Kremlin-inspired separatists as well as these other groups that we've looked at, that the rebellion in Donbass probably would not have happened. Or if it had happened, it would have been more easily put down by official Ukrainian military units. So in other words, right? In other words, it isn't that there's more Nazis on one side than the other or something like that. It's not that one side is right and one is wrong. What the author here is saying is that the role these extremists played in Donbass and in these breakaway regions was far more important in significance to broader events, to eventual civil war and where we're at now, than anything that happened on the Ukrainian side. And I think the author is correct here as well. With the passage of time, Russian far-right groups became less important in Donbass. A quasi-state structure took hold in Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and the need for Russian radical nationalists began to disappear. And I think that that's why a lot of this content is from 2014 and 2015. When I made a video on the Azov Battalion, that wasn't the case. There was content in 2022, 2021, etc. And perhaps that's why this isn't discussed as much, because after the initial uprisings occurred, and after this war essentially began, we could say, right, the need for these groups dissipated, and either they kind of became absorbed into larger military regiments, kind of like Azov did in Ukraine, or they left and shipped off to greener pastures. So I think that there's some truth in that as well, that yes, they were there to do the dirty work in the beginning, but now the people that are fighting and the groups are much more organized. So for conclusions, far-right neo-Nazi groups and individuals have been working alongside Russian forces in Ukraine. Russia allows for right-wing extremist groups to train and operate. There's an argument for right-wing extremists playing a larger role in pro-Russian forces of Donbass than Ukraine. Russia gets all the narrative. And that's what I'm talking about when I do a search and I get all results for Azov and none for RIM. But overall, narratives are too simplistic, as stated with that article discussing the Spaniards that were arrested, talking about fascists and communists fighting next to each other, and the other article stating how right sector members found a member of a supposed Russian military unit with a swastika on his back. These things are too simple, and it's not an either or type thing. And if you're engaging in that type of discussion with somebody, they have ulterior motives. Okay, so like, subscribe, do all those things that we do for social media. Check me out on Twitter. I'm on there all the time. These videos take me some time to compose. This is not my prime source of employment, so I'll continue doing these as I can. Thanks all.